My name is Marie, and I'm 62 years old. For nearly 4 decades, I stood beside my husband James as we built our fashion design company into an international success. When James died 3 years ago, our son Timothy took over. I never expected that one day Timothy would look me in the eye and say those words that shattered my heart. "You're a burden." I sold Dad's company. Good luck paying rent. But when he did, I simply smiled and replied with 3 words that would change everything. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If my journey resonates with you, please subscribe and like this video. I grew up in a small town in Nebraska where fashion meant whatever was on the clearance rack at the local department store. My parents worked hard to make ends meet, and I learned early on that creativity could transform even the simplest materials into something beautiful. I would take old clothes and redesign them, turning outdated styles into something fresh and exciting. When I was 18, I received a partial scholarship to study fashion design in Chicago. That's where I met James Anderson. He was studying business and had this infectious vision about revolutionizing American fashion. We met in the campus coffee shop when I spilled my latte all over his economics textbook. Instead of getting angry, he looked at the fashion sketches that had fallen out of my portfolio and said, "These designs could change the industry." We fell in love quickly. James had a mind for business that complemented my creative vision perfectly. By our senior year, we were already planning our future together, not just as a couple, but as business partners. We married right after graduation and used our combined savings of $5,000 to rent a tiny space in a not yet trendy part of Chicago. That little boutique, James and Marie Designs, was the seed of what would become Anderson Fashion House. Those early years were a beautiful struggle. James would handle the books and sales while I designed and sewed. Some nights, we'd sleep on the floor of our boutique because we'd put every penny back into the business. Our first big break came when a local society woman wore one of my designs to a charity gala. Suddenly, our phone was ringing with orders. When I became pregnant with Timothy at 24, we faced our first major decision as a company. James wanted to open a second location. I supported the vision, but knew I couldn't manage design production and a new baby all at once. So we compromised. I would step back from the day-to-day operations to raise our son, but remain the creative heart of the company. "You're the secret ingredient," Marie, James would tell me. "I can handle the business side, but your designs are what make us special." As Timothy grew, so did our company. By the time he was 10, Anderson Fashion House had boutiques in 5 major cities. When he was 15, we expanded internationally, opening our first European store in Milan. I would work from home, sending designs to our growing team of pattern makers and seamstresses. Every few months, we'd all travel together when James had important meetings or I needed to oversee a new collection. Timothy grew up watching this empire build around him. He attended business school like his father, and it seemed natural that he would someday take his place. James mentored him carefully, bringing him into the company at 22, starting at entry-level positions, despite Timothy's protests. "You need to understand every aspect of what we've built," James told him. By the time Timothy was 35, he was serving as Chief Operating Officer, with James still at the helm as CEO. I remained the creative director, though I had assembled a talented team of designers who could execute my vision. Our company had grown beyond our wildest dreams, from that tiny Chicago boutique to a global fashion house with hundreds of employees, an annual revenue in the hundreds of millions. Then came the day that changed everything. James was only 65, still vibrant and full of ideas. He was in his office reviewing quarterly projections when he suffered a massive heart attack. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. The grief was overwhelming. James wasn't just my husband. He was my partner in everything. We had built our life, our family, and our business together. Timothy was devastated too, though he processed his grief differently. While I needed time to mourn, Timothy threw himself into work. Within weeks of the funeral, he stepped into his father's role as CEO. At first, I was proud of his strength and dedication. I stayed on as creative director, partly because designing was the only thing that gave me solace, and partly because I felt it was what James would have wanted. Timothy seemed to welcome my continued involvement, often asking for my input on major decisions. Dad always said you were the heart of this company. He told me during those early months, I need your guidance more than ever now. If only I had recognized the warning signs sooner. The subtle changes in his tone when discussing my contributions, the growing impatience when I'd reference how James might have handled a situation, the way certain meetings would be rescheduled without notifying me. Small things easily dismissed as the natural adjustment of a son finding his footing in his father's legacy. But they were harbingers of the storm to come. About 6 months after James passed, Timothy met Stephanie Blackwell at a charity gala. She came from old money with family connections throughout the fashion industry. They began dating, and their relationship progressed quickly. Within a year, they were married in a lavish ceremony that made the society pages. I was happy for Timothy. He deserved love in his life, especially after losing his father. At first, Stephanie was perfectly cordial to me. She'd compliment my designs and ask questions about the early days of the company. But there was always something calculated in her interest, as if she were studying me rather than connecting with me. Shortly after their honeymoon, I began noticing changes in how the company operated. Meetings I'd normally attend were suddenly scheduled during my regular studio time. When I'd ask about them afterward, Timothy would say, "Oh, it was just operational stuff, Mom. Nothing that would interest you." Then came the subtle changes to our upcoming collections. Designs I had approved were modified without my consultation. Fabrics I had selected were substituted for cheaper alternatives. When I raised concerns, Timothy would say, "We need to modernize, Mom. Your aesthetic is classic, but we need to appeal to younger consumers." One afternoon, I overheard Stephanie talking to Timothy in his office. "Your mother's designs are outdated. The company needs a fresh direction if we're going to stay competitive." I waited for my son to defend my work, the work that had built this company from nothing. Instead, he said, "I know. I'm working on transitioning her to an advisory role." The first truly painful moment came during a board meeting 6 months after Timothy's wedding. I presented my concept for our spring collection, a line that honored James's vision while pushing into new territory. Before I even finished, Timothy interrupted. "Thank you, Mom, but we've already decided to go in a different direction. The design team has created an alternative concept that the board approved last week." I stood there, stunned. Last week, I wasn't informed of any meeting. Timothy smiled tightly. "It was a quick decision. We didn't want to bother you with the details." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. These were people who had known James and me for decades, who had watched our company grow. Yet none of them spoke up. After the meeting, I tried to talk to Timothy privately. "I'm still the creative director of this company. Major design decisions should at least involve my input." He sighed, checking his watch. Mom, the fashion world is changing rapidly. We need to be agile. Your process takes too long. The market won't wait. This isn't about my process, I said. This is about respect for my position and experience. Maybe it's time to consider stepping back, he suggested. Enjoy your retirement. Dad would want you to relax after all these years. Your father would want me to protect what we built together, I countered. Timothy's expression hardened. What you built, what you always remind me you built. I'm running this company now, Mom. Times have changed. Over the next few months, I was systematically excluded from more and more decisions. My office was relocated from the executive floor to a smaller space near the design studio. My assistant was reassigned without my knowledge. Even longtime employees began avoiding my gaze in the hallways. I started investigating on my own, reviewing financial reports that were still accessible to me as a board member. What I found disturbed me. Timothy was making decisions that prioritized short-term profits over long-term stability. Quality was being sacrificed for margin. Our loyal manufacturing partners were being replaced with cheaper options. One evening, working late, I discovered an email accidentally left open on a shared computer. It revealed something that made my blood run cold. Timothy was in negotiations to sell Anderson Fashion House to an Italian luxury conglomerate. The company that James and I had built from nothing that bore our family name, that was supposed to be our legacy. Timothy was preparing to sell it without even consulting me. I printed the email and confronted him the next morning in his office. "Were you ever going to tell me about this?" I asked, placing the paper on his desk. He glanced at it, his expression hardening. "That was on a private server. You had no right." "I had no right. This is my company too, Timothy." "It's not your company anymore, Mom. Dad left controlling interest to me. He left you the responsibility to steward what we built, not to sell it to the highest bidder." Timothy leaned back in his chair, James's chair. "This is a business decision. The offer is extremely generous and the timing is right. The fashion landscape is changing." "So you keep saying," I replied. "But this company isn't just about profit margins. It's about the vision your father and I had. It's about quality and integrity. It's about survival," he snapped. "And your outdated notions are holding us back. This sale is happening. I don't need your approval." I left his office, shaking not just with anger, but with heartbreak. How had my son become this person? Where was the boy who used to sit in my studio watching me sketch with wide-eyed wonder the next week? I discovered my appointments with several longtime business partners had been canceled without my knowledge. When I called to reschedule, I learned that Timothy had informed them. I was stepping back from daily operations due to health concerns. It was a lie designed to ease me out while preserving the company image. Then came the day I arrived at the office to find my personal belongings packed in boxes. My design archives, the sketches, and fabric swatches I'd collected over decades, all removed from my workspace and replaced with sterile modern decor. "We're updating all the executive offices," my new assistant explained nervously. "Mr. Anderson thought you might be more comfortable working from home." That evening, I called Timothy, demanding an explanation. "You're 62, Mom," he said coldly. "Most people your age are retired. You've had your time. Now it's mine." "Is that what this is about?" I asked. "Some sort of competition between us?" "You always were the center of attention," he replied bitterly. "Dad's brilliant wife, the creative genius behind Anderson Fashion House. Do you know what it was like growing up in your shadow, hearing everyone say the company would be nothing without Marie's designs? The revelation stunned me. Timothy, your father and I were partners. We both valued each other's contributions. Dad could have been bigger, he continued, as if I hadn't spoken. We could have expanded faster, taken more risks. But everything had to pass your approval, fit your aesthetic, meet your standards. I realized then that Timothy had been nursing this resentment for years. In his mind, I hadn't been the heart of the company. I'd been its limitation. And now, with James gone, he was finally free to reshape Anderson Fashion House as he saw fit, or to sell it entirely. Over the next few weeks, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Timothy and Stephanie became increasingly bold in their efforts to push me out. My company email was accidentally deactivated. My security clearance was downgraded, restricting my access to certain areas of the building. Longtime employees who remained loyal to me were reassigned or let go. I tried reaching out to board members I'd known for years, people who had been friends with James and me. Most avoided my calls. Those who did speak with me expressed sympathy, but claimed they were powerless against Timothy's controlling interest. The sale, they informed me, was moving forward rapidly. Then came the morning Timothy's assistant called, requesting my presence in his office at 2 o'clock. Perhaps I thought he had reconsidered. Perhaps some remnant of the son I'd raised still existed within the cold businessman he'd become. I arrived at his office precisely on time, dressed in one of my own designs, a simple but elegant navy suit that James had always loved. Timothy wasn't alone. Stephanie sat beside him, her expression a mixture of smugness and affected concern. "Mom," Timothy began, not bothering to stand when I entered. "We need to discuss some practical matters." I took a seat across from them. "I'm listening." "The sale of Anderson Fashion House is finalized," he said. "The paperwork has been signed, and the announcement will go out next week. The Italian group is retaining the company name and most of the staff, but they'll be implementing their own creative direction." I nodded, having already accepted this painful reality. "I see, and you called me here to tell me this in person. I appreciate that small courtesy, at least." Timothy and Stephanie exchanged a glance. "Actually," he continued, "there's the matter of your living situation." "My living situation?" I repeated, confused. "The house," Stephanie interjected. "The mansion is company property." I stared at them, the implication slowly dawning. "That's our family home. Your father and I bought that house 30 years ago. It was transferred to company ownership 15 years ago as a tax strategy," Timothy said. "Dad's idea, if you recall. As part of the sale, all company properties will transfer to the new owners." I remembered the transaction. It had been our accountant's recommendation, and since we owned the company, it had seemed like a mere technicality at the time. "So what are you saying?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Timothy straightened some papers on his desk, avoiding my eyes. "You'll need to vacate the property within 30 days. A cold shock ran through me. "You're evicting me from my own home." "It's not your home," Stephanie said smoothly. "It's an asset that's been sold." I looked at my son, searching for any sign of the boy I'd raised. "Timothy, that house contains 40 years of memories. It's where you grew up. It's where your father and I built our life together." "Sentimentality isn't good business," he replied coldly. "The new owners have been generous in allowing you 30 days to relocate." "And where exactly am I supposed to go?" I asked. He shrugged. "That's not really our concern, is it? You've had a good run, Mom. Most of your generation would have been pushed out years ago. You should be grateful for the time you had." It was then that he delivered the line that would change everything between us forever. "You're a burden. I sold Dad's company. Good luck paying rent," he said with finality. The room seemed to spin around me. Not just the cruel words, but the casual way he delivered them, as if he were discussing the weather rather than destroying his mother's life. But something strange happened in that moment. Instead of breaking down, instead of pleading or arguing, I felt a curious calm settle over me. James's voice seemed to whisper in my ear, "Remember what we discussed, Marie? Remember the contingency plan." I smiled, which clearly wasn't the reaction Timothy expected. "All right, good luck," I said softly. Timothy blinked, thrown off balance by my response. "Good luck. That's all you have to say. What else is there to say?" I stood, gathering my purse. "You've made your decision. So you'll leave without a fight?" Stephanie asked, sounding almost disappointed. I looked at her, then back at my son. "I've never been one for public scenes. Your father knew that about me." I walked to the door, then turned back. "I wish you both all the luck in the world. You're going to need it." With that, I walked out, head held high. I maintained my composure. Through the lobby, past the curious eyes of employees who had no doubt heard rumors. I nodded politely to the security guard, the same man who had greeted James and me with respect for decades. Only when I reached my car in the parking garage did I allow the mask to crack. The tears came in a flood, heaving sobs that bent me over the steering wheel. Not just for the betrayal, though, that cut deep. Not just for the company, though that loss was devastating. I wept for James, for the cruel transformation of our beloved son, and for the legacy we had built with love, now dismantled by greed. When the tears finally subsided, I sat in silence, watching the sunset paint the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and pink. James had loved this view. We would often stay late at the office just to watch it together. "What would you do, James?" I whispered to the empty car, and in that moment, I remembered the conversation we'd had shortly after his first heart scare, 5 years before his death. The careful plans we'd made together, just in case. The precautions James had insisted upon, despite my protests that they were unnecessary. "Timothy is a good boy," I had told James then. "He would never betray us." James had smiled sadly. "I hope you're right, Marie, but power changes people. Money changes people. And Timothy has always wanted to prove himself. I pray he never has to make that choice, but if he does, we need to protect what we've built, and we need to protect you." That night, when I returned home, the home I was now being evicted from, I went to my closet and opened my jewelry box. Behind a false panel that James had installed was a small compartment containing a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter in my husband's handwriting, along with a USB drive and a key. "My dearest Marie," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then our son has made choices that have forced your hand. I'm so sorry. I hoped this day would never come." The next morning, I called Richard Harmon, who had been our company's legal counsel and James's close friend for 30 years. I asked to meet him at his home rather than his office, explaining that the matter was highly sensitive. Richard welcomed me with concern. His wife, Susan, made us tea while I gathered my courage to explain the situation. I handed him James's letter first. "James asked me to come to you if this day ever arrived," I said as he read. Richard's expression grew increasingly grave. When he finished, he looked up at me with a mixture of shock and admiration. James was always 10 steps ahead. I should have known he would have a contingency plan. Is it real? I asked. Will it work? Richard nodded slowly. Oh, it's very real. And quite brilliant. He held up the letter. May I make a copy of this? We'll need to move quickly. I nodded, and Richard went to his home office. While he was gone, Susan took my hand. Marie, I'm so sorry. Richard told me about Timothy taking over after James passed, but we had no idea things had deteriorated to this point. Neither did I admitted. I kept making excuses for his behavior, telling myself he was just finding his way. Richard returned with copies and a legal pad filled with notes. Here's what we need to do. First, we need to access that safety deposit box with this key. Then, we need to file these documents with the Patent and Trademark Office immediately. And we need to contact the Italian company before the final money transfer occurs. Will you help me? I asked. Of course I will, Richard said firmly. James was my friend, and so are you. What Timothy has done is not just cruel, it's legally questionable at best. The safety deposit box contained exactly what James had described in his letter. The original documentation proving that while Anderson Fashion House was the public face of our business, all intellectual property, design archives, patterns, and trademarks had been separately registered under a holding company called M&J Designs, a company solely owned by me. James had created this structure 15 years earlier, around the same time we transferred our home to company ownership. He had explained it to me then as insurance, protection against corporate raiders or unforeseen financial difficulties. What he hadn't explicitly stated, but what I now understood, was that it was also protection against our own son. When Anderson Fashion House began, every design came from my sketchbook. As we grew, I trained and led a team of designers, but the core aesthetic, the signature elements that made our brand recognizable worldwide, those were still mine. James had ensured that ownership of those elements remained with me, separate from the corporate structure that Timothy now controlled. The implications were staggering. Timothy had sold the corporate entity, the physical stores, the inventory, the equipment, but without the intellectual property rights, without my designs, patterns, and the Anderson aesthetic, what the Italian company had purchased was essentially an empty shell. Richard helped me draft a letter to the CEO of Bellini Luxury Group, the Italian company that had purchased Anderson Fashion House. I explained the situation and offered to meet with them in Milan to discuss licensing arrangements for the intellectual property their purchase required. They'll be furious, I worried as Richard's assistant rushed to send the communication securely. Initially, perhaps, Richard agreed, but they're business people. Once they understand the situation, they'll want to negotiate. And you, Marie, will be negotiating from a position of strength. Next, Richard helped me secure a modest apartment in a neighborhood across town. I began quietly removing personal items from the mansion, focusing on irreplaceable mementos and photographs. I left the valuable furnishings and artwork. Those had indeed been purchased with company funds, and I would not stoop to Timothy's level of pettiness. The most difficult part was reaching out to loyal employees who had been pushed out during Timothy's tenure. People who had been with us for decades, who had been discarded like obsolete machinery. I was surprised by how many responded to my careful messages with enthusiasm rather than bitterness. "We've been waiting for someone to stand up to him," said Gloria, who had been our head pattern maker for 25 years before Timothy replaced her with a younger, less expensive team. "The company hasn't been the same since Mr. Anderson passed." Within a week, I had assembled a small but dedicated team working from my new apartment. We converted the second bedroom into a design studio, and the dining room became our meeting space. It wasn't glamorous, but it had the collaborative, creative energy that had defined the early days of Anderson Fashion House. Meanwhile, Timothy and Stephanie had flown to Milan to finalize the sale and celebrate their triumph. According to Richard's contacts, they were expecting the final payment of $300 million to hit their account during a champagne toast at Bellini's headquarters. What they didn't know was that Richard had filed our documentation with both U.S. and Italian authorities, and Bellini's legal team had received our communication. While Timothy and Stephanie were in the air, the entire deal was being scrutinized by very concerned executives and lawyers. I couldn't sleep the night I knew they would be arriving in Milan, not out of anxiety, but from a strange mixture of sadness and vindication. I had never wanted to stand against my own son, but he had left me no choice. James had foreseen this possibility, and in his wisdom, he had armed me with the tools to protect myself. "I hope you can forgive me, Timothy," I whispered into the darkness of my new bedroom. "And I hope someday you can understand why this had to happen." I later learned exactly how it unfolded in Milan. Timothy and Stephanie had been welcomed warmly at Bellini headquarters. They were taken to a conference room overlooking the Duomo, where champagne and pastries awaited. The Bellini CEO, Marco Vannucci, had been all smiles as they discussed plans for the new era of Anderson Fashion House. Then, Marco's expression had changed. "Before we proceed with the final transfer, there is a small matter we must address." Timothy, confident in his position, had barely looked up from the financial documents. "What matter?" "We have received some concerning information regarding intellectual property rights." That had captured Timothy's full attention. "What are you talking about?" "All IP is included in the sale." Marco had slid a folder across the table. Copies of the documents Richard and I had provided. "According to these records, all design patterns, trademarks, and creative assets are owned by a separate entity, M&J Designs, controlled solely by your mother." Timothy's face had drained of color as he scanned the documents. "This is impossible. These must be forgeries." "Our legal team has verified their authenticity," Marco replied. "The registration dates back 15 years. Your father was quite thorough." Timothy had pulled out his phone, checking his bank account to confirm the final payment. Nothing had been deposited. "This is outrageous," Stephanie had interjected. "We had a deal." "Indeed we did," Marco agreed. "For a fashion house with valuable intellectual property. Without those assets, I'm afraid Anderson Fashion House is worth perhaps 10% of what we agreed to pay." "My mother put you up to this," Timothy had accused. "She's trying to sabotage me." Marco had remained professional, but firm. "Mrs. Anderson has contacted us with a licensing proposal. She is willing to negotiate terms that would allow Bellini to utilize the Anderson designs and aesthetic. Our board finds her terms quite reasonable, actually." "And if we refuse," Stephanie had demanded, "then we renegotiate our purchase at a greatly reduced price, or we withdraw entirely. But understand, without the IP rights, the value of your company drops enormously." Timothy had stormed out, Stephanie trailing behind him. Back at their luxury hotel, he had made frantic calls to his lawyers, only to have them confirm what he already feared. The documents were genuine, filed properly years ago, and legally binding. When he finally reached me by phone, his voice was a mixture of fury and panic. "What have you done?" he demanded. "I've done nothing, Timothy," I replied calmly. "Your father did this. He protected what we built together. You've ruined everything. The deal is falling apart." "The deal can still proceed," I told him. I've offered Bellini reasonable licensing terms. They seem quite receptive. So you get to control everything. After I did all the work to negotiate this sale, I sighed, feeling a deep sadness rather than triumph. No, Timothy, I get to protect your father's legacy, something you showed no interest in doing. This isn't over, he threatened before hanging up. 3 days later, Timothy and Stephanie returned to Chicago. By then, I had moved completely into my apartment. My small team and I were working on concepts for a new collection. Not for Anderson Fashion House, but for a new venture I was calling Second Chance's Design Studio. I knew Timothy would come looking for me eventually. When the buzzer rang and the building security called to announce Timothy Anderson was demanding to see me, I wasn't surprised. I told them to send him up. He looked terrible when he entered my apartment. Unshaven, his expensive suit rumpled from travel dark circles under his eyes. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to crawl into my lap after a nightmare. "Is this your revenge?" he asked without preamble, looking around my modest new home. "Hiding in this place, destroying everything I worked for. This isn't about revenge, Timothy," I said, offering him a seat he didn't take. "This is about preserving what your father and I built, what we hoped you would continue to build. By undermining me, by going behind my back, like you did to me," I countered. "Excluding me from meetings, canceling my appointments, selling the company without even consulting me, evicting me from my home of 30 years. He had no answer for that. "I never wanted this confrontation," I continued. "All I wanted was to remain part of the company, to help guide it forward while respecting its history. You're the one who made that impossible." "So what now?" he asked bitterly. "You control the IP, so you control everything. Now we have choices," I told him. "Bellini still wants to proceed with the acquisition, but on revised terms. They'll pay $30 million for the physical assets, much less than before, but still significant. They're offering an additional $100 million for a 10-year license to use the Anderson designs and aesthetic. And my role in all this? That depends on you," I said. "I've proposed a new structure where I would serve as creative consultant, ensuring the integrity of the brand during the transition. You could remain in an executive role if you choose, or you could take your payment and walk away." Timothy paced my small living room, running his hands through his hair, a gesture so like his father that it made my heart ache. "And if I refuse, if I fight this legally, you'd be fighting your father's careful planning and Richard's legal expertise. You'd likely lose, and you'd definitely drain your resources in the process. Is that really what you want, Timothy? More conflict, more bitterness?" He stopped pacing and finally looked at me. Really looked at me. For the first time in months. "Why did Dad do this? Why didn't he trust me with the company?" "He did trust you," I said gently, "with the operations, with the business side. But he also understood temptation, power, the allure of a quick profit over sustained quality. He wanted to ensure that what made Anderson Fashion House special couldn't be sold off or discarded." "The way I tried to discard you," Timothy said quietly, the realization finally dawning. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He sank onto my sofa, suddenly looking exhausted. "I've made a mess of everything, haven't I?" "Not everything," I said. "Not yet. There's still a chance to salvage something worthwhile. Why would you even offer that? After what I said to you, after how I treated you?" "Because you're my son," I said simply, "and because your father would want me to give you one more chance." Timothy stayed for 2 more hours that night. We talked more honestly than we had in years, about his resentments growing up, about his fears of never measuring up to his father, about Stephanie's influence and ambitious plans. By the time he left, nothing was resolved, but a door had been opened. A possibility of reconciliation existed where before there had been only scorched earth. 6 months later, Anderson Fashion House was operating under new ownership with a restructured agreement that protected both the company's future and its past. Bellini had acquired the physical assets for $40 million, a fraction of the original price, but still a significant sum. They had also entered into a licensing agreement with M&J Designs, my company, for the use of the Anderson aesthetic and archive. The arrangement included several key provisions. I would serve as creative consultant with final approval on major design directions. Timothy would remain as a liaison between Bellini and the American market, though with reduced responsibilities and compensation. Most importantly, a portion of all future profits would be directed to a foundation established in James's name, supporting fashion education for underprivileged students. It was not the outcome any of us had envisioned, but it was one that honored the company's origins while securing its future. The Anderson legacy would continue, albeit in a different form. Timothy and I were slowly rebuilding our relationship. The process was painful, filled with difficult conversations and moments of raw honesty. Stephanie had left him when it became clear that his financial windfall would be much smaller than anticipated, and his power within the company greatly diminished. Her departure had been another blow, but also an awakening for Timothy about the nature of loyalty and love. Meanwhile, I had discovered an unexpected joy in my new freedom. Second Chances Designs Studio had evolved from a temporary workspace into a boutique design firm, specializing in custom creations for women over 50. Without the pressure of quarterly profits or trend forecasts, I found myself designing with the same passion and creativity I had in those early days with James. My team had grown to include several veterans from Anderson Fashion House who had been pushed aside during Timothy's tenure, along with young designers who brought fresh perspectives. Our small studio had become what the original boutique had been, a place of collaboration, innovation, and respect for craftsmanship. Timothy visited the studio regularly, sometimes offering business advice, sometimes simply observing. Slowly I saw glimpses of the thoughtful boy he had once been emerging from beneath the hardened executive he had become. One afternoon, as we shared lunch in my office, he asked the question that had clearly been weighing on him. "Do you think Dad would be disappointed in how everything turned out?" I considered this carefully. I think he would be sad about the pain we both experienced, but I think he would be proud of where we've landed. He always said that the true test of a business isn't how it handles success, but how it recovers from setbacks. "I still don't understand why he set things up the way he did," Timothy admitted. "Didn't he trust me at all?" "He trusted you with many things," I said gently. "But he also knew that business can change people. Money can change people. He wanted to ensure that no matter what happened, the heart of what we built couldn't be lost." "The heart being you," Timothy said with a small smile. "The heart being the values we established from the beginning," I corrected. "Quality over profit, creativity over conformity, treating people with respect. Those were the principles that built Anderson Fashion House, and they're the ones that will sustain whatever comes next." Timothy nodded thoughtfully. I lost sight of those. Somewhere along the way, I started measuring success only in dollars and deals. "It's an easy trap to fall into," I acknowledged. "Your father and I had each other to stay grounded. You took on everything alone after he died. Not alone, Timothy said ruefully. I had Stephanie pushing me to prove myself, to be more aggressive, more modern in my approach. We all need the right partners, I said, in business and in life. As we finished our lunch, Timothy helped me clear the table, a small gesture that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. I've been thinking about that foundation in Dad's name, he said. I'd like to be more involved, maybe mentor some of the students. I felt a warmth spread through my chest. I think that would be wonderful. Your father would be so proud. That evening, alone in my apartment, I found myself looking through old photographs of our family. James holding baby Timothy. The three of us at the opening of our first major store. Timothy's graduation. Moments of connection and love that had somehow been buried under years of ambition and miscommunication. I realized that the betrayal that had seemed like an ending had actually been a painful but necessary new beginning. Without that moment of crisis, Timothy might never have confronted his own misguided priorities. I might never have discovered my capacity to stand firmly for what I believed in. And the true legacy of Anderson Fashion House, not just the designs or the brand name, but the values and vision behind them, might have been lost forever. The journey had been painful, but it had led us all to a place of greater authenticity and purpose. Timothy was slowly finding his way back to the values his father had tried to instill in him. I was discovering a new chapter of creativity and leadership I never expected to experience. And somewhere, I like to think James was watching over us all, satisfied that his contingency plan had achieved exactly what he'd hoped, not just protecting me or the company, but ultimately saving our son from himself. As I put the final touches on designs for our new collection, one specifically dedicated to women reinventing themselves in their second acts, I felt a sense of peace and possibility I hadn't experienced since James's death. Life hadn't turned out as I'd expected, but in some ways, it had turned out better, more authentic, more aligned with what truly mattered. The betrayal that had broken my heart had ultimately freed me to find my own voice again. And for that unexpected gift, I was genuinely grateful. Has someone ever betrayed your trust in a way that ultimately led to something positive in your life? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories of transformation and renewal. And please share this video with someone who might need a reminder that even our most painful experiences can lead to unexpected blessings. Thank you for joining me today, and remember that it's never too late for a second chance.